Hello and welcome back to the afternoon debate here at the Institute for World Politics. At this time, it is my great pleasure to introduce Frank Marlowe. He is the Dean of Academics here at the Institute for World Politics. He's a former professor of strategic studies at the Marine Corps Staff College. He served as assistant for the counterproliferation policy for the Secretary of Defense, and he is the author of Planning Reagan's War, Conservative Strategists and America's Cold War Victory. Frank Marlowe.
Thank you all. Thank you for being here. I want to thank all of our partner organizations that were involved in this debate. Michael and Julianne, thank you for everything you guys have been doing. The Victims of Communism Foundation, as well as the Claremont Institute, who have been doing so much work and so much hard labor putting all of this wonderful event together. I'd like to thank the debaters from this morning. I thought it was a very interesting, very heartfelt debate. I thought it was a lot of fun to watch, and I'm looking forward to seeing what our debaters this afternoon have to say. So once again, thank you all for being here. If there's anything we can do for you here at IWP, please let us know. Otherwise, just sit back and enjoy the debate. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce the afternoon debaters, beginning with Micah Uetricht. He's the managing editor of Jacobin Magazine. He's co-author of the forthcoming Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from Sanders' Campaign to Democratic Socialism, and the author of Strike for America, Chicago Teachers Against Austerity. He's a member of the Democratic Socialists of America and lives in Chicago. Micah Uetricht. Nicole Ashoff is the author of the forthcoming book, The Smartphone Society, Technology, Power, and Resistance in the New Gilded Age and the New Profits of Capital. She's the managing editor of the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism and an editor-at-large at Jacobin Magazine, where she writes about technology, labor, and political economy. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's Nicole Ashoff. On my left here, we have Michael Anton. He's a lecturer in politics and a research fellow at Hillsdale College's Kirby Center. Prior to joining Hillsdale, he was the spokesman for President Trump's National Security Council. He also served as speechwriter for President George W. Bush and spent 12 years in the private sector in various roles in finance and media, and is the author of the famous essay, The Flight 93 Election. And our final debater today is Mike Gonzalez. He's a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation and writes on national identity, diversity, multiculturalism, assimilation, and nationalism. He's the author of the 2014 book, A Race for the Future, How Conservatives Can Break the Liberal Monopoly on Hispanic America. His latest book, The Plot to Change America, will be published next year by Encounter Books. And our moderator, Michael Walsh, is a cultural historian, the author of 16 books, including The Devil's Pleasure Palace and The Fiery Angel. Michael and I are co-founders of the Imprimatur Group. Michael.
Thank you, Julianne, and welcome everybody. Welcome back, those who attended and saw the morning debate. Let me just briefly outline the proposition and the rules. This debate will last 90 minutes. The proposition reads as follows. Resolved that socialism/communism, having failed in the 20th century at the economic level, now seeks to implement its social goals via cultural Marxism. Arguing in the affirmative, we have Mike Gonzalez and Mike Anton. Arguing in the negative, we have Micah Uetricht and Miss Ashoff. You're not named Michelle.
I'm not named Michelle.
Right, the only one of us who's not named Mike here. Nicole, thank you so much. We invite each of you to give a 4-minute opening statement. At the 3:30 mark, you will hear 30 seconds from our official timekeeper, and we need a hard stop at 4 so we get the debate in on time. After that, the discussion will be free and open. I will be guided by me according to the principles that you've laid down in your opening statements. And at the end, each panelist debater will have a 4-minute rebuttal, and we will go in the opposite direction from where we start. So we will start with the first affirmative, which will be Mike Gonzalez. Is that correct?
Yes.
Take it away.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, all of you, for being here. I think the proposition is pretty much self-evident. Marx and Engels said inherent contradictions in what they called capitalism, I will just call freedom, would bring about its destruction in industrial societies. They were very specific. In their opinion, the fierce competition of markets would eat away at the wages of the workers, but also at the profits of the owners of capital. Large enterprises would swallow up the small ones, and revolution would naturally follow everywhere. Marx wrote about this a lot in Das Kapital. He said the revolt of the working class, a class united, organized by the very mechanism of capitalist production itself, was growing. The death knell of private property sounds. Except that never happened. Not only was the revolt of the proletariat not inevitable, but it was, like everything else they predicted, highly improbable. Industrial workers did not successfully rise anywhere. When revolutions came, it was in agrarian societies such as Russia or China. Industrialized England and France did not set up any Soviets. Moreover, when workers were organized, it was not by the mechanism of capitalist production, but by militant minorities who were intellectuals. This consistent failure in their predictions dawned on later communists. Lenin himself came to understand that there would be a need for a revolutionary vanguard to drill the consciousness of oppression into workers. But it wasn't really until the Italian communist leader Antonio Gramsci comes along in the 1920s with his theories of hegemonic oppression that we get the mutation of cultural Marxism. Now, Gramsci wrote that man was weighed down by history. Quote, otherwise it would be impossible to explain why it is that when the exploiters and the exploited have always existed, socialism has never yet come into being. The reason for the lack of revolutions in industrial societies is obviously that Marx, as usual, had completely misunderstood the nature and human needs and desires. The people wanted the goods that capitalism offered, as Herbert Marcuse and the other Frankfurt School professors discovered, much to the chagrin and horror in America in the 1950s. But to Gramsci, that was because the worker had completely bought into the belief system of the bourgeoisie. That was the hegemonic narrative. Nicole herself in your book have written about the fact that society needs stories. This hegemonic narrative would have to be completely overturned, and a Marxist counter-narrative would have to be implemented. This would have to be a root and branch transformation. It is this complete re-education that is cultural Marxism. All the cultural institutions need to be taken over. The left must assume control of the universities in Hollywood and all the culture-making institutions. This obviously introduces coercion. It becomes stifling. Everyone has to be politically engaged all the time, participate in the transition, and then the constant building of socialism. The system becomes totalitarian. And in fact, totalitarianism joins economic scarcity and shortages as the end result of communism. These are features of the system. These are not bugs of the system. I think communists know this. I think because they're not dumb people. They know that central planning is inefficient and produces shortages. They know that coercion is required. I think that they just believe that these are worthwhile trade-offs for destroying the bourgeoisie and eliminating individual private property, which is their greatest bugaboo. Thank you very much, and I yield the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. The first negative will be Mr. Utrecht. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, Michael Utrecht.
The question of cultural Marxism that we're debating today has always been a strange one for me. Despite being an editor of a Marxist journal, I haven't always understood what is meant by cultural Marxism. I published an article about a month and a half ago called What a Popeye's Chicken Sandwich Would Look Like Under Socialism. I don't know if that's cultural Marxism because it's doing cultural critique of a chicken sandwich from a Marxist point of view. We should start off first by saying that the way that cultural Marxism has been discussed in American society in recent years in particular has verged on conspiracy theory, one with slight anti-Semitic roots. Of course, we know that the mass shooter in Norway several years ago in his manifesto talked about cultural Marxism. He was striking a blow against cultural Marxism. Similarly, the massacre that took place at the Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue not too long ago, that shooter also talked about cultural Marxism. So this is the way that cultural Marxism is discussed and used to justify some very violent and vile acts in American and global society recently. For us, socialists, members of people who work for a socialist magazine and are members of a socialist organization, Mike referred to the cultural Marxism being about cultural institutions needing to be taken over, that people need to be politicized all of the time, and that to me it sounds like it's an argument that cultural Marxism is the skeleton key that unlocks everything that has gone on the left over the last few years or even few decades. But as the editor of a Marxist magazine, I have to say that that is not how I view my own socialism or how I go about putting out my politics, as well as the politics of the organization that I'm a member of, the Democratic Socialists of America, which is the most important socialist organization in the US. Instead, we go about our politics in a fully democratic way. We are running candidates for elections, whether on the local level or on the national level. We're organizing within unions. We have intellectual projects like Jacobin, in which we put out our point of view about what socialism should look like in the 21st century, what we can learn from and what we should avoid of socialist projects of the past. And to me, that is if we're being honest about what the socialist project of the 21st century that is rising right now looks like, it is a bit more boring than a conspiracy of cultural institutions being taken over by scheming intellectuals. It is a democratic grassroots politics that comes from the bottom up.
Thank you. Michael Anton.
Okay. Whether or not cultural Marxism per se is a thing, the Frankfurt School per se is a thing, we just have to ask ourselves, first and foremost, if the original Marxist theory is correct, then it would seem to be that all the people with the money would be on the right and all the people without the money would be on the left. That's not the way 2019 America or the Western world appears to me. It seems that all the centers of power in our world, the tech companies, finance, the universities, with their giant endowments, they're all on the left. Corporations, through their HR departments, through their advertising, push these sort of left-wing narratives. So how did that happen? I think the answer is essentially what my colleague here said. The Marxists changed the terms, in part because Marxism, like all aspiring social science, is supposed to be predictive. It predicted a bottom-up revolution from the working class. That didn't happen. It decided to force it. There's a realization somewhere 100 years ago that the theory wasn't working out, and we're going to change the terms. I'm going to read a quote here that I think is very apt. This was written 32 years ago by Alan Bloom from The Closing of the American Mind. He had already figured this out. He says, Marxist ideology is no longer very distinctly tied to economics, nor is it simply determined. It has been cut loose from necessity's apron strings in creativity's role. Random causality just does not, since Nietzsche seems sufficient to explain, irrational causality, seems sufficient to explain the historically unique event or thought. Capitalist ideology is now instinctively taken to be something more like the Protestant ethic than what is described in Capital, that is Das Kapital, Marx's magnum opus. When one talks to Marxists these days and asks them to explain philosophers or artists in terms of objective economic conditions, they smile contemptuously and respond, that is vulgar Marxism. As if to ask, where have you been for the last 75 years? Well, we can update that. Where have you been for the last 105 years, since this was written so long ago? Vulgar Marxism is, of course, Marxism. Non-vulgar Marxism is Nietzsche, Weber, Freud, Heidegger, as well as a host of other leftists who later drank at their trough, such as Lukács, Kojève, Benjamin, Merleau-Ponty, and Sartre, and hoped to enroll them in the class struggle. So this bait and switch happened quite a long time ago, and I think its fruits are very fully with us now in an age of woke capital and leftist power in the very centers that used to be considered right-wing, supposed right-wing strongholds. All of the centers of wealth, the banks, the big companies, those are not conservative institutions anymore being threatened by the proletariat. They are explicitly pushing a much more left-wing social agenda than they would have, say, 50 years ago, and a lot of people haven't caught up. Now, I will say, in response, partial response to this morning's debate, listening to that, I realized that compared to some of my friends on the right, I'm kind of left-wing economically, in an older sense, right? I sympathize with the people in the middle being left out of the new regime who've seen their wages decline, their industries get shut down, their factories closed, and so on and so forth. And I wonder, where's the modern left in support of collective bargaining, tariffs, and certain of these things that the left was all about in the 50s and 60s, that they've almost completely abandoned. Maybe not the two of you, maybe not the two earlier debaters, but the real power centers in this country that have run the left today have. And yet their big enemy, the person they revile more than any in the world, President Trump, is for these things. You know, it used to be common in my circles on the right, the intellectual right especially, to say, I'm fiscally conservative but socially liberal. That's kind of what the blue state left is today. We can argue how fiscally conservative they really are. They're definitely socially liberal, right? To me, the appeal of Trump or the Trump movement or a populist movement is to actually be kind of the opposite, a little bit more fiscally liberal, adopting economic policies, not socialist economic policies, but that benefit the working class and the flyover, the red counties and states and so on like that, but a little bit more socially conservative. Take your foot off the gas a bit on this massive amount of cultural change that we're forcing at an ever accelerating rate.
Thank you. Nicole, would you pick up the thread and
Sure.
give us your opening statement?
Good job.
Thank
You remember my name.
Yes.
All right.
Well, I'm so confused by all the Michaels.
I too was a bit puzzled when I saw the prompt for cultural Marxism, and I started thinking a little bit about how many of the kind of social movements that we're seeing emerge today are being explained from the right as a result of cultural Marxism. So I thought I'd respond to that a bit. I think we live in an interesting and exciting time. All around us, we see the emergence of vibrant social formations fighting for the rights and dignity of women, people of color, LGBTQ people, indigenous people, and of course, working people trying to make a life for themselves and their families. And as we've seen with the climate justice movement, and more recently with the teacher strikes, movements all over the world actually, increasingly these formations are interconnected. They're in both in their vision and also in their actual networks. They're fighting for a vision of a more just, democratic, and ecologically sustainable world. There are some people who look at these movements and see them as a bad thing, or who don't support the emancipation of oppressed people. Moreover, they see these movements as a result of a shadowy cabal of Marxists pulling strings from the ivory tower. And moreover, that these movements are actually putting us on the path to totalitarianism and the destruction of the Judeo-Christian West, as it's been called. The people who make these claims are not only on the wrong side of history, but lack a clear understanding of history, in my opinion. The long, hard-fought, and ongoing struggles for freedom and dignity of oppressed peoples in the United States and elsewhere are fundamentally grassroots movements. They are shaped by the passions and goals of the ordinary people who struggle in them. And since the 19th century, socialists have been a key part of these movements. So if we want to think about the role of socialists in shaping thought from the 19th century on, one of the key things is through their struggle in grassroots movements. And the reason why socialists have been a core part of these movements is because they share a vision of a better world in which every person has the space and opportunity to thrive. And we at Jacobin are just one kind of source of working out these ideas and thinking about and reporting on the kinds of movements that are happening. And that's as far as I can, I'll stop there.
Thank you. All right, well, we've already raised some interesting issues. One of the ones I'd like to throw out first is this notion, political notion, of a wealth tax that both Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders have articulated and at least obliquely proposed. So let me ask you, Nicole, would you comment, where does the socialists stand on the idea of a wealth tax?
Well, I certainly can't speak for all socialists, but I personally am in favor of a wealth tax. I think it's would be a really effective way to actually redistribute resources that are collectively generated to actually put in place the kinds of gains we need to rein in big corporations and also make long-term plans for dealing with the looming climate crisis.
What right do they have to tax someone's inherited wealth? What's the philosophical justification?
Well, I'm sure we'll disagree about this, but in my opinion, wealth is collectively generated. One person doesn't create wealth by himself or herself. They rely on the knowledge and resources, taxes, and efforts of a very broad span of people. And therefore, we need to take that into consideration when thinking about how to share our collective wealth.
Okay. Mike Anton?
On the wealth tax, I mean, I may scandalize some of my friends. I think I'm against it. On the other hand, the thing that it's trying to address, I think definitely needs to be addressed, right? An old-fashioned liberal, an old-fashioned leftist would look at income inequality, wealth inequality, the Gini coefficient, and these things, see it deepening and widening and getting bigger over the last 30, 40, 50 years, and be worried about that, and a conservative would say, I don't care. In my sense, I see the script sort of being flipped. I see the tech left, the finance left, which is where all and certainly the university left with their gigantic untaxed endowments that others have, I think, wittily referred to as hedge funds with little schools attached. They're, of course, against this. So no, don't touch it. Sacred. I don't know that the tax on wealth per se, that Senator Warren or Senator Sanders is the way to address it, but one way or another, I think the country has got to get to grips with the fact that this is a growing problem and put in place policies, whether that's industrial policy, whether it's tariffs, there's other things that at least turn the trend around, start to narrow the wealth gap, start to let the people in the middle class, the lower middle class, the working class, however you want to define it, feel like they're part of this society, they're part of this economy, that people care for them, and that they have a future. And they haven't felt like that in a couple of decades. And I think there's a pretty sound reason why they haven't felt like that in a couple of decades. And that sentiment is what's driving the sentiment behind the wealth tax. It's not going to go away. We're going to have to channel it in a more productive direction, in my view.
Mike Gonzalez, why not tax John Kerry's wife's wealth? What has John Kerry done to generate that wealth, and what right does he have to expropriate it through marriage, for example?
Can I address two things that were said?
Yes, go ahead.
Let me just address two things that the two of you said. The first one is this trope of anti-Semitism. Look, I don't think Horkheimer or Marcuse or Adorno practiced any religion whatsoever. In fact, Gramsci, who began cultural Marxism, when he says there's a cultural hegemony, we have to change everything over, he was half Albanian, half Italian. He was a Catholic, or Catholic upbringing. The problem is, and nor were Hegel Jewish or Marx or Kant or Nietzsche. Sorry, Marx was Jewish. Yes. The issue is that they were German. There was a continental. They were followers of the Continental Enlightenment, and they had a very different view of liberty and everything else from the English and the Scots, the English and Scottish Enlightenment. But the second thing I want to address is, you both of you touched on this, is that these are bottoms-up grassroots things. They're not. Micah, you yourself write about how the unions need to have, I believe you call them the militant minority, and you say yourself the militant minority need to be Marxist, they need to be well-versed ideologically, and if left to their own devices, the workers and the non-Marxist union leaders will not get to the change in society that you need. So you know this is not a grassroots thing. And none of these groups, I just written a book on this, the groups, the collectives that have been created, Hispanics, Asians, MENA, which was about to be created, these were created by activists that were elites. And the people at the grassroots had to be convinced of these things. And I really will detail it in my book. So it's not a grassroots thing at all. By the way, just very briefly, I believe that you, at Jacobin, which I do read you're not cultural Marxist. You're old-time Marxist. You're Bernie Sanders Marxist. You're economic Marxist. I think you do realize that you have to, in Marcuse's words, use a substratum of society to get a working minority and be able to wedge in these ideas. So you're quite willing to use identity politics and cultural Marxism. But at the end of the day, you guys are economic Marxists, old-fashioned ones, I think.
Let me just bring it back to the wealth tax, because we're going to get into that. Nicole, what right does John Kerry have to the money of his wives? Why should that or should not that money be taxed? I use Kerry as an example, but we could use the Kennedys as well.
Those are two separate questions.
Well, just to pick up on the notion of the wealth tax, you said you're in favor of that.
Yeah.
And what is the philosophical basis? Oh, you've mentioned the philosophical basis for that as well. I'm sorry, Micah. Can I toss that question to you then? What is the foundational notion that we should have a wealth tax in this country? What is the determining factor? Do you tax Bill Gates' wealth, or do you tax the Kennedys' wealth? One is inherited and one has been recently created.
I think we should tax all of the ultra-rich capitalist wealth, whether it came from someone like Bill Gates, who started a company on his own and accrued an incredible amount of wealth that he managed to get from people who were working for him, and that is the basis of his wealth. Or if it's from the Kennedys or the Kerrys, or I subscribe to the notion that has been put on the political agenda recently that billionaires shouldn't exist, period. So whatever the only way that I think that anyone can amount $1 billion is through hoarding the wealth and stealing the wealth from the rest of society. And so that's my basis for one.
So you would say wealth is a criminal act in some sense.
Well, the hoarding of resources to the extent that you become a billionaire certainly is a criminal act, yes.
Mike Anton.
If I were cynical, which I'm not, I endeavor every day and every thought to be as high-minded as I possibly can. But if I were cynical, I would say, wow, there's a real basis for agreement here, because when I look out at billionaires, they're all my political opponents, adversaries, and enemies. So yeah, let's just tax the heck out of them and reduce their power. Why not? I think we can reach across the aisle and come to some kind of agreement there. And I wonder if our opponents here grasp that, the extent to which that's true, or if they would deny it, that capital, the massive amounts of capital, Silicon Valley finance, hedge funds, university endowments, other places in American society, are not held by right-wing actors. They might have been 100 years ago, 150 years ago, they probably certainly were, but they're not today. So if we want to go after those guys, you might actually have an ally in me.
I'll debate the three of them.
Wait.
Oh, sorry.
So,
Nicole.
Mike, you said I would like to respond to something, and you directed a direct question at Micah. I'd like to just push back when you say Jacobin uses identity politics when it's convenient. This is a very crude accusation, and I would definitely say that that's not at all how we would think about identity politics, if we even want to use that term. When we write about things that are happening around the United States, we're writing in a way that really respects the contours and characteristics of these movements and listen to the voices of the people who are shaping these movements, many of which I disagree with you are truly grassroots movements. And the people are speaking for themselves. It's not about us sort of shaping the dialogue and using identity politics when it's convenient. Can I just respond to this question? I think that the right-left divide is actually something that Marxists push back on and socialists push back on as a sort of defining framework for understanding politics, because it's often not very useful, as you said. When we think about these intense sort of consolidation of wealth and power, certainly it's in institutions that maybe are not sort of traditionally what we would consider as these sort of evil right-wing corporations. They're helmed by people who espouse, very sort of supposedly progressive views. That's besides the point. I think the issue is that we have to look at the negative impact of these concentrations of wealth, regardless of the politics or rhetoric that the owners of this wealth profess to.
Okay, well, a lot of interesting points have been raised here, so I want to pursue these. I sense on the left that you regard, as we said a moment ago, the accumulation of wealth as a kind of crime. And while you've criticized the notion, the very existence of cultural Marxism as a conspiracy, are you not also being conspiratorial in your attitude towards capitalism, in that it's some kind of a conspiracy against marginalized groups who have been actively prevented from accumulating wealth as well? Either one of you.
Well, I don't think that it's a conspiracy. It's this way that the system is set up, that there are a tiny number of people who get rich from owning the means of production, and especially without checks on the politics and the distribution of wealth that flows from that, the vast number of people are immiserated. So I don't think it needs to be a conspiracy. I don't think that there need to be capitalists, in dark, smoke-filled rooms, divvying up the pie about who's going to get what, and we're going to screw the vast number of people in society and keep it all for ourselves. This is the basic functioning of the system. You're rewarded for accumulating as much wealth as you can and hoarding it, and that's how the system works. So I don't think it needs to be, it almost doesn't need to be fully planned out. You don't have to set about wanting to organize society this way for it to turn out that way under capitalism.
But you've articulated a distinction, on one hand, it seems to me, between Western and, shall we say, white capitalism, as opposed to the groups that you've mentioned: women, gays, LGBTQ, the people of color, marginalized people. Is that somehow the result of a conspiracy that these groups are marginalized? Mike Gonzalez?
Actually, let me just address the billionaire thing that you asked me to begin with.
Yeah.
I think that the people that we have today who are billionaires, I don't know if Sheryl Sandberg is a millionaire today, but definitely Bezos, Bloomberg, these are people I don't agree with them politically, but they created their wealth by fulfilling a need. Facebook is something that I use. The internet is something that I use. So if they came into this, they definitely deserve for having created a lot of benefit for mankind to benefit from it. So I don't think that we should tax them and penalize them for that. Nicole, I was actually trying to praise Jacobin. I was saying that you guys are actually colorblind. You really, your approach is colorblind. When I read you're colorblind. You talk about the workers. I think that there's a belief in some of your writers. I discern that there's the using of these discrete groups that I'm sorry, we're created by elite activists. And if you look at the history of it in the 60s and 70s, we're not a grassroots things by any means. To gain a political majority, to gain at least a Bolshevik majority. So the question you asked was what? Just now?
I'm sorry, I've lost the plot. Wandered field, but we have a question from the audience, which I would like to read and for anyone to take a look at. And this goes to the whole notion of wealth. Does it matter that the workers who collectively created the wealth for the company were financially compensated for that work, that they entered into a free contract to do X for Y money? How does that tarnish the accumulation of that wealth? Either of you?
Sure. We can say that they are compensated, but we can also ask whether they are compensated fairly. When you're looking at...
But who is to determine the fairness of compensation? I
think we could start with a very sensible baseline of people being able to afford a home, send their children to a good school, and maybe allow their family to have a healthy diet, send their children to college, maybe go on a vacation, have some savings. These are things
What's preventing them from doing that in the first place?
They are not fairly compensated for the work they do. That's what's preventing them. They work hard and they don't make enough money to live. And you said these companies are making so much money, but they pay their workers fairly. And I'm saying no, they don't. And if we just to get to your point, Mike, just again about the wealth tax, and we're thinking about the tech companies and they made something amazing. Yes, it's true, but the technology that they rely upon to make that amazing thing, much of it was funded originally. The research was originally funded by taxpayers and developed in publicly financed institutions, and then commodified and used for private gain.
I want to pursue this notion of Nicole with Mike Anton. Then how do we determine fair compensation? Should the government do that? Should the market forces do that? Is it your tough luck if you sold? Let me use the example of a painter. You paint a painting and you sold it for $200, and later on you turn out you're Rembrandt, and now it's going to sell for $10 million, perhaps in your lifetime. Isn't that your tough luck, Mike Anton?
Well, I'm going to try to split the middle here and say, it can't be purely the market, because we're not an economy fundamentally. We're a country that has an economy, and a country, qua country, has citizens who are tied, as my old teacher John Marini would say, in bonds of civic friendship, right? And if we just say we're nothing but an economy, let the market decide, and if 10 people own everything and all the rest of you have nothing, the market decided. That's bad politics, right? It's a recipe for instability, and I would say injustice. Now,
can I follow that
command and control from the top, dictating wages, prices, these kinds of things, as economic theory and practice doesn't work. But there are also policies that we could put in place that nudge the market, that push the market, that limit it, that shape it, right? We'll leave it to operate. There is no purely free economy anywhere in the world anyway. Every single country on the planet does some extent of this. The one issue that I've not heard anyone bring up, I'll bring it up now finally I'll get booed, is if we really want to raise some wages in this country, we should help President Trump implement serious immigration reform to tighten up the labor market, right? This is one of the things that absolutely benefits woke capital and the oligarchs I talked about. A very, very large supply of constant immigrant labor puts downward pressure on wages. This is one of the big reasons why people can't afford homes. They can't go on vacations. They've seen their wages decline, stuff like that. But boy, does one get shouted at angrily if one brings that up. But I'm for that, because I want to benefit the wages. I want to see the wages of my fellow citizens rise in the near and medium term, as they have not risen by some metrics and even possibly declined since the early 1970s.
Well, there is a strain of conservatism that says, it goes by the popular name of corporations, that the corporations are a pure expression of capitalism. They should be free to do whatever they want, and if it's rapacious capitalism, then that's just too bad. On the other hand, we do know that, for example, in Los Angeles, when people are hoping that some of the minority groups will eat healthier, that they put in health food stores in those neighborhoods, they immediately go out of business, and yet there's a McDonald's or a fast food place on almost every street corner in South Central. So at what point does personal responsibility kick in? I'll throw that to you.
Well, can I just respond to Mr. Anton, because I think you sort of answered a question that you raised earlier about whether or not there's common ground between our different political projects, and you were speaking to problems of deindustrialization or excess power within capital. And I think you've just now hit on the place where we would diverge very significantly, which is that the proposed right-wing populist response to the excess power of corporations, the rising income inequality in the country and in the world, is to harden borders, to keep out immigrants from other countries, and to say that they are responsible for the problems that we are wrestling with in this country. And the socialist contention is that that's just not true. That immigrants are, immigrants come to this country from wherever, from countries like Mexico and Central America in large numbers right now, in part because of the climate change that we have played such a huge role in pushing, and then that they're desperate for a better life because they're suffering in their home countries, wealth inequality, unfair treatment, military intervention over the past century in their countries, and so our contention. I mean, we're speaking to some of the same issues about wealth inequality, income inequality, and all of that, but we would diverge very sharply in saying that the solution to that, or that the reason for those problems existing in the first place is because of immigrants. We would strongly dispute that claim and say that it comes from the people who actually hold power in society, which is everyone from the far right capitalist to the tech democratic, capital D democratic tech CEOs that you're referring to.
But surely you're not saying that climate change stops at the Mexican border, and that the influx of migrants from Mexico is caused by us causing their climate to change, thus driving them to our country. Doesn't that sound like a crazy conspiracy theory, Mike?
Well,
Anton?
It sort of. I mean, if you think about this for a second, I did absolutely expect to be opposed, and I was. My expectations were met on that question. But I think that points to an inconsistency in the policy that we're talking about here. First of all, you used the word earlier. If I have this correct, I wrote it down with quotes around it, so I hope this is right, enmiserated, as if people are being enmiserated in modern capitalism. Well, I doubt that that's actually true in the purely material sense. If you look by any metric, the poorest person, certainly in an OECD country and what a so-called advanced economy today, is much, much richer than a very rich person of a century or 2 centuries ago, things like that. If we are enmiserated, and I think there is some misery going around, it's a kind of spiritual enmiseration, which has a lot of causes, including from whatever you want to call it, cultural Marxism, or this sort of left-wing social policy and idea marched through the institutions over the last 100 years. I think there's some immiseration that's also being caused by this massive inequality by big cadres, tens of millions of people who can look at the economy we've built and say, I'm just left out. I can't get ahead in this world. I'm going to go nowhere. And the powers that be absolutely don't care about me. Look, the so-called right-wing capital, concentration, people or whatever, capitalists, the bankers, the tech oligarchs, and so on that you talked about, they love mass immigration. Why do they love it? Precisely because it pushes wages down. They understand their bottom line pretty clearly. And regarding the environment, I would say, look, if we were more serious about environmentalism itself would be a cause for immigration reform and tightening, because what do you think happens when people come here from a country where whatever their carbon footprint is much lower. They come to the United States. Does their carbon footprint go up, stay the same, or go down in the United States with our, higher standard of living, bigger houses, cars, things? Of course it goes up, right? This is just, it's illogical. It has to be true. And just my final point, getting back to immiserated, nobody comes here in order to be immiserated, right? You come from another country thinking that your life's going to be better when you get here, and in particular thinking that your life is going to be materially better when you get here. And for almost everybody who comes as an immigrant, that's true. The question is that policy working for the citizens who are already here, right? Do they get a benefit, or do they not? And I think it's not working. It definitely works for the newcomers. They're not immiserated. Their quality of life goes up. Does it work for the existing citizenry? It hasn't been for a long time, and I think that's one of the reasons why immigration policy and practice over the last 30 years has become very unpopular, in particular with the people who have been economically left behind, that the old capital L left would have stood up for much more forcefully than they do.
Mike Gonzalez, you were born in Cuba. You have firsthand experience of Cuban communism. Can you speak to these issues from that perspective? I'm leading into a discussion of identity politics here, so I want you to start from your own origins, and we'll proceed from there.
Well, one thing I never have written in my life, and an editor recently asked me to say, can you start the sentence as a Cuban American? I said, no, I'm not going to start the sentence as a Cuban American. Who cares? It's my ideas that matter. I did live in Cuba for 12 years, and that's the thing that gets me. Why do you guys want to bring this back? It's got a perfect record of failure everywhere. It always ends in tears. It always ends in oppression. It doesn't matter what your motives are. It ends in as I said, it's stifling. People have to participate all the time. There's no room for dissent. You call yourselves democratic socialists, but your democracy, the way you define democracy, is very different from what I think of that. I think the democracy is the rulers have to go to the people and ask for the consent of the government every once in a while. You want constant participation at every worker Soviet all the time on everything, and it's got to be. And you want to get rid of labor markets and capital markets and have everything decided by these sectoral markets, and there's no room for dissent. There's only a room for how do you reform the 5-year plan. But if you want to put up your hand and say, no, the 5-year plan sucks, there's no need for a 5-year plan, that's not allowed in your sense of democracy. And once you have transformed society in the way you intend, there's no going back. It's not like, well, okay, well, the Democratic Socialists will get in, and then after 4 years, the Republicans will get in, and the Republic will not change. No, you want to fundamentally change the United States of America, which has produced, and I'll be the happy camper here. I don't think things are as dark as have been presented here. I think the country is doing fairly well, not for everybody, and we need to do better for people for whom it's not doing well. But, I think America is worth preserving. It's worth to keep from being transformed the way you guys want to. And if you get power, you will do it.
An excellent point. And I want to give our friends here on the left a few minutes now just to speak exclusively on these subjects, because we want to give everybody equal time. Take it away on these issues, on immigration, on the fact that you seem to be categorizing people, and we keep using this term power imbalance, which is a fundamentally Marxist term. Isn't that some sort of variety of cultural Marxism, and especially the way it's used now to not combine and unify people, but separate them by family origin or by ethnic heritage or by income levels? This talk of income disparity, for example. So what if there's income disparity? These are some of the issues on the right that we'd like to hear for you address, either one of you.
So we both can, I think, just because there's a lot there. I'd like to just respond to you, Mike. I think that you misunderstand our vision and goal. Certainly no one is cheerleading a return to some dogmatic 5-year plan-led system where dissent is crushed and democracy is non-existent. I think that sounds abysmal, and no one wants to sort of try to recreate something that failed. Certainly, myself, when I read and think about history and I look at what things worked and what didn't work, and I think the left is probably the most critical of its own history and thinking about what actually worked and didn't work. What we're envisioning, and I say we, I mean sort of like younger democratic socialists on the left and people who are trying to build an alternative to the kinds of staggering inequality and not just sort of material immiseration, but also sort of, a kind of, like you're saying, this kind of feeling like you have no trust in the democratic institutions, you have no trust in the kind of people that are supposed to represent you, or trying to build something. You say, why does it keep coming back? Well, it's because people want a better life, and they see the world around them, and they want to have more of a say in how their community is shaped. And they want to have a say in their workplace, and they want to build a better future for their grandchildren. That's why these ideas keep coming back, because capital continuously sort of takes and doesn't allow for people to live and thrive their fullest life.
But isn't this, let me interject a question, isn't this partially a conspiracy theory of economic development? Cannot these disparities be explained by something other than power imbalance? Can they be explained by ineptitude, for example, that someone is poor not because he's oppressed, but because he wasn't able to compete in the society? I throw this to Micah.
I think those ideas have a pretty ugly history in our country of the people's material situation is based on their sort of inborn ineptitude. That's something that we certainly reject, especially when the system is set up to concentrate power and resources in one direction and sort of take them from the bottom and concentrate them at the top.
Let me ask this question. Who set up the system? Is that not a conspiracy theory by saying the system is designed to let person A succeed and person B fail? Who would go to set up a system that deliberately fails?
Oh, not deliberately, no, certainly. But that is the way that the system functions. On the question of dividing people up, if you listen to the rhetoric of someone like Bernie Sanders, who is the most prominent, political representative of this rising 21st century socialist movement in the United States, you will hear rhetoric about inordinate amounts of power and wealth among extremely wealthy people, but you'll also hear a call to people's better angels, to, for example, in his Queensbridge speech that he gave not long ago, to look around the audience of 26,000 people that were gathered there, look to someone who doesn't look like them, who is a different religion of them, different gender, different sexual identity, etc., and pledge to fight with them and for them. And I think that is at the heart of this 21st century socialist vision, is a sort of, in some ways, a kind of new, I guess it's answering a sort of spiritual question. It's sort of speaking to the desire for unity among large groups of people. I mean, it is true, objectively, that there are a very small number of people who have a large amount of wealth and power, and they are the reason that we can't have nice things. But among the vast majority of us, there is a call among this new 21st century movement for unity amongst those different groups, not for different kinds of dividing people up into different demographic groups.
Mike Anton, doesn't this just sound like jealousy?
Well, look, I now have concluded I'm definitely more cynical than I thought going in, because when you said that the current model of our economy or our society is to take from the bottom and concentrate at the top, that's not what I see when I look at it. All you have to do is change one word, and I think you have it right. Take from the middle and concentrate at the top. That's the current model. That's the model that's been going on for 30 to 50 years. And then redistribute to the bottom just enough to keep the lid on, right? To keep the bottom from revolting. If I may do the gauche thing of quoting myself, I wrote 4 years ago a piece about San Francisco. I grew up in Northern California, and I sort of watched it evolve over the years into a town that now, despite the filth on the street that we all read about every day, it just worships wealth in a grotesque way that would have been impossible to imagine in the 70s and 80s if you were around San Francisco. And one of the ways that the oligarchs have done it is they buy off lefty activists, and they buy off sort of the bottom rungs of society, and who turn out to be rather cheap dates. And the oligarchs laugh all the way to the bank. And that's the situation we're in now, and I find it bizarre and amusing, but I'm kind of used to it, that you have to be some sort of outlier, former conservative, or now economic centrist pro-Trump guy like me to see it. And it doesn't seem like anybody on the left understands it, except Mark Zuckerberg and all of the guys who run the VCs on Sand Hill Road when they cash their checks. They understand the business model pretty well.
Micah used the expression, the better angels of our nature, but that's a Reaganist expression, isn't it, Mike Gonzalez?
Yes,
It's actually
he came up
Lincoln
with it, but
originally.
He did use it. Lincoln.
Oh, yes, of course. Reagan used it, but Lincoln put it, of course, in the speech. But so, to what extent, either side now, are your arguments being co-opted by the other side? Do we find that an appeal to religion, for example, from the left, or an appeal for income redistribution on the right, there's a kind of crossover going on? We talked about synthesis earlier this morning. Go ahead.
I mean, obviously, I think we all have been like hedging on the bushes here. The abandonment of religion, the fact that the West is de-Christianizing, especially Europe, abandoning, yes, Judeo-Christian values, is one of the reasons why you're having this, what Michael Anton perhaps and the others would call an untrammeled, unfettered capitalism that does not have the checks that religion and norms previously had on it. So I think that is, but there is a reason why the left is atheist. There's a reason why the left, why Nietzsche said, God is dead. These things happen for a reason, just the same way that the family had to be abandoned because, of course, it was a patriarchal family and it was, linked to the individual private, ownership of things. So I think that yes, if Micah and Nicole want to make an argument for a return to religion and a return to norms, I'd be very happy to join them, and I think that would be a nice check on the excesses of an untrammeled capitalist society.
Let's pick that up. Nicole?
Just to maybe leave out religion and talk about developing a new normative framework where we respect each other and accord every person dignity and the sort of right to thrive. And I think, yeah, we can be on the same page. I think we talk about the decline of religion, and first of all, not everyone on the left is an atheist. I think that's not true. When we think about the decline of religion, and that's a little bit bumpier than you paint it out to be in the United States, particularly, I think what we're really missing is a kind of moral framework, right? People want to have a sense of morality, of right and wrong, and feeling like they have something to be proud of, and feeling like there's a bigger vision that they believe in. If they got that from religion and they no longer do, well, then that's an interesting question, right? And there's a broader sort of crisis. The crisis is not just that people can't pay their bills, right? It's a broader crisis of a loss of legitimacy for the kind of way that we've organized society over the past 30 years. And that's a multidimensional crisis.
But you started by saying, let's leave out religion. Why do we have to leave out religion?
No, we were talking about a point of agreement.
A point of agreement.
But I mean, it was Marx who said that religions were the opiate of the people. Christianity and Judaism gave you that dignity of every human being because it was made in the image of God. We had the norms. Perhaps not the two of you, but the left, made us let the country, tried to get the country to abandon these norms, to walk away from them. I'm not making this up. You know that it is true. I'm not saying that every leftist is an atheist.
Well, it sounded to me like I might have been associated with the term untrammeled capitalism, that was my critique, and I want to clarify. I don't believe that that's what we have now. I don't know that any country has ever had that. Maybe the closest thing was pre-handover Hong Kong, pre-1997, routinely ranked by various studies as the freest economy ever, and yet it still had taxes, it still had minimal regulations, it still had a small safety net. There's never been pure capitalism. But we absolutely don't have that now. The big corporations that are making all the money and that I've talked about a lot are heavily regulated, and they're not that, they probably wouldn't choose it for its own sake, but they know how to use that to their advantage by making it a giant barrier to entry of anybody honing in on their business model. And they also have the money to lobby Washington in ways that a medium or small enterprise or network of small enterprises don't. The system is not untrammeled open capitalism. The system is, to use a loaded word, kind of rigged in favor of these places where the wealth is concentrated, and not in a right-wing way, but in just an old-fashioned oligarchic way. I mean, if we could exhume Aristotle and say, look at the United States right now and write another chapter of the politics, what does this look like to you? You know, he wouldn't use the terms left or right. He's not, those don't exist in his day, but he knows what an oligarchy is, and that's what this would look like to him, I think.
Let me throw this to the left here, to use that contemporary term. Hasn't the left already won in many important respects? Haven't many of the policy goals that have been advocated for the past century, don't we already have them in place? And if so, at what point do you stop agitating for, as President Obama said, fundamental change? What's so necessary about fundamentally changing the United States?
Well, we have certainly made important progress in key areas that the left has agitated for, whether it's around civil rights for racial minorities or around the feminist movement or gay liberation, trans liberation, increase in immigrant rights. But we also in this country have flat wages that have been flat for decades while worker productivity rises. We have, as we've been discussing, unprecedented economic inequality that dates, it hasn't been this bad since the Gilded Age. And so I think the reason that socialism is back on the agenda in the 21st century is that the old problems are still with us, and they've reared their head with a vengeance. They haven't gone anywhere. And so we haven't seen society, despite the very important gains that we've made in the areas that I mentioned earlier, we're still stuck with the system that is concentrating wealth and power in small hands, and there needs to be fundamental change to change that. That is the socialist case, and I believe that socialists are finding an audience for this case because people feel this on a gut level in American society in the 21st century.
Mike?
I just want to add, I don't believe that we have untrammeled capitalism either. I thought some people were making that argument. As someone, and I will start a sentence saying, as someone who has lived in Hong Kong for 8 years, I was in the streets of Hong Kong in '97 when the handover took place. It does have taxes, but it starts pretty much at a middle class wage, and then it's flat. Regulations were so low that you could set up a company literally the same day, and it really produced. These things work. They work. They work. I lived in two islands, Hong Kong and Cuba. I'll tell you, one worked, the other one did not. And again, it's not. When I said, why do you want to keep bringing this back? It's not. There's no clamor for socialism. It is, Micah, the militant minority that you write about, the ideological Marxist, minority that Gramsci wrote about, that Lenin thought was needed, that Marcuse wrote about. These are it's Jacobin who tries to bring this back. There's no clamor at the bottom for take my health care away or take my property away or come in and confiscate everything.
Am I allowed to disagree with my own team?
Of course you are.
A little bit, not much. I don't know how we would define clamor, but you sent around surveys, and I'd seen these many surveys like it too. You group people by age. Do you support socialist policies? Do you consider yourself a socialism? The younger the cohort you get, the higher the bar rises, right? So it's going up for some reason.
They don't know what it is.
Well, I don't know if I would call that a clamor, but when whatever it is, anywhere but 30 to 40% of people in their 20s say, I'm open to it or I support it, and that's clearly risen over the past decade or 2 decades, something's happening, and that's probably very comforting and gives you the warm fuzzies over here. I look at it, I get a little alarmed by it, but I also say, I think I kind of know why this is happening. These are people who look at the system as it's been going for a while, and they realize this isn't working for me, and I'm not going to be able to live the way my parents did, or even maybe my older brother or my older sister. So I'm casting about for solutions. I don't think genuine socialism, ownership of the means of production, wealth taxes, things like that are the solution. But I'm also not that confident that traditional conservatism, as it kind of came together and ossified in the Reagan era, offers much either. And I was in Hong Kong for the handover too, as it happens. I loved it. I thought it was great. I was just using that as an example of the freest economy that I know of that's ever existed. Still had a certain measure of regulation. It's always going to. So this perfect freedom will never exist.
I want to bring us back just a second. I want to bring this back to our cultural Marxism topic, because we're wandering into economic Marxism here. And this is a question for anybody. You cannot deny the existence of the Frankfurt School, the Gramsci, Lukács, and their successors. Marcuse was a very major influence in American education during the 1960s. and the assault of critical theory on fundamental truths of America that had not been questioned before. But as you know, critical theory is that anything can be questioned and, if possible, taken apart in an analytic way that negates its value. So how can we say there's no such thing as cultural Marxism when the influence of these thinkers is so powerful, so strong, and the documentary influence is manifest, and hasn't that affected all of the changes we're seeing in the United States today?
Yes, the Frankfurt School existed. Yes, those people had an impact on the ideas of the time. And yes, I think they did, in general, advocate critical inquiry into culture and art and the economy and all facets of life. Now, to say that they questioned it was not to say that they sort of blindly also advocated taking everything apart and to show that it has no value. I think it's, critical theory is fine. Critical theory is great. It's about questioning the institutions that make up society, particularly when we have a society that is extremely hierarchical and has persistent hierarchies over time. It's only natural that critical thinkers would want to know why this is the case and start to really try to unpack and unpeel the kinds of foundations of these inequalities. That being said, to draw a straight line from the Frankfurt School writ large to I don't even know what the outcome is that you are referring to is difficult, not least because the Frankfurt School and later sort of British cultural studies and the later postmodernism, these fields don't even agree with each other and have very different arguments and goals. So that's where I'll part ways with you and sort of say I don't see that strong.
Well, let me ask over here, is that true? Or are they not really?
No, 25 seconds on the young. In Animal Farm, Napoleon takes away the puppies, and then they come out through the middle of the book and start chasing Snowy. If you take over the institutions and you teach these kids that Marxism is good and you delegitimize the United States, of course they're going to sign up to these things, but they don't know what socialism is. They really do not, I don't believe. Now, on Marcuse, of course he was extremely influential. Talk about taking over the institutions. He was worked very closely with Rudi Dutschke, the one who came up with the long march through the institutions.
This is the German Revolution.
Right.
Yeah.
He was a professor of Angela Davis, who famously goes around now and tells college campuses that ethnic studies are the intellectual arm of the revolution. Bill Moyers admits about 10 years ago that he was sending essays by Marcuse to LBJ in the White House. I don't believe that LBJ ever read Marcuse, but we know that people around them, including Bill Moyers, did. So I think that, yes, these thinkers are incredibly, and all you have to do is look through the footnotes of the activists, the people who write about critical race theory, of everybody in a grievance study department at a university, and they'll be greatly influenced, not just by the Frankfurt School, but also by the postmodernists, Jean-François Lyotard, Derrida, Michel Foucault. The influence is very strongly there intellectually.
Can you deny the influence of the Frankfurt School on contemporary American society when, for example, one of the principal tenets of the philosophers of that school was an attack on the family, an attack on what we might call traditional notions of sexuality, and now we have boys winning girls' races in Connecticut, and is that where you want this revolution to go, Mike?
I don't deny the influence of the Frankfurt School, of Marcuse, etc. I never heard that Marcuse essays were sent to LBJ, but I have no reason to deny that. But I am the managing editor of the most important socialist journal in the United States. I never think about the Frankfurt School. We don't publish essays on the Frankfurt School. It's been a very long time since I've read Marcuse. It's certainly not the Frankfurt School thinking behind the explosion in electoral activity in the Democratic Socialists of America, in the rise in intellectual activity around socialism. These are not our lodestars, and I just find it bizarre that there is a fixation on it that me as a participant in the 21st century movement, I don't share.
Mike.
I mean, I believe you when you say you never think about it explicitly, or those thinkers, maybe you read them a long time ago. There's an extent to which, though, everybody alive has a kind of intellectual, background radiation that we maybe don't think about. The names don't occur to us, but they've shaped the way we think, and whether we realize it or not. My old teacher, Harry Jaffa, used to love to quote a line from, I think it was John Maynard Keynes, who says, even the most eminent economist thinks that he's coming up with a new idea when really he's reinterpreting third hand the ideas of some scribbler from a couple generations back, and he doesn't even know it. To direct answer to your question, Michael, of course, yes, it was influential, but all of these kinds of trends and influences, there's never one cause, right? It's not monocausal. So the Frankfurt School is getting active, I think, in the 20s, right? Well, Charles Beard has already written an economic history of the United States by then, which is a complete Marxist attack on the foundations of the country, calling the founding principles a lie and a scam and things like that. Becker, I forgot exactly when he wrote his book on Carl Becker, his famous book on the Declaration of Independence, where he also calls it 22. Okay, Steve Hayward is here, ladies and gentlemen. Same thing. You can't say this came from them. There are currents that are maybe flowing at the same time, cross currents. There's a lot of overlap.
Well,
you got to go back further, though.
Well, certainly during the Woodrow Wilson administration, you had an overt attack on the Constitution.
Right.
Nicole.
I'd just like to say something on this fear of indoctrination. I think it's interesting, this idea that we just sort of, are spoon-fed these ideas from our professors, and we just kind of blindly absorb them, and they shape our worldview. I think Mike probably read more Frankfurt School than I have, and you hold the views that you do. I got my PhD up the road at Johns Hopkins, and we read much more Adam Smith in grad school than Karl Marx, right? The idea is to allow us to be critical thinkers and to read people that we disagree with and to formulate our own opinions. And yes, that is certainly going to be shaped by the people that we admire, our teachers, if we admire them. But we are also intelligent, free-thinking humans, and we can develop our own ideas. And reading and studying people that we disagree with, there's no better way to understand your own position. So I think that we need to be cautious about making stories that hinge on indoctrination.
Well, look, I went to college a long time ago at a liberal place, and I've really never been anywhere but liberal places for the most part. And it was, in a way, this is a very Grandpa Simpson kind of thing to say, but it was different then. So I'm in a liberal place, and I have all these liberal professors, but if I wanted to write a conservative paper critical of what they were teaching or an assignment, nobody ever held it against me, and I didn't really necessarily feel indoctrinated. Now, I'm still around colleges. I teach college now, an overtly conservative college, but I'm also around a lot of college kids and grad students, and you can call this anecdotal if you want, but it's not therefore unspecific. I only hear one thing from people, which is it's completely different now. We're much more, it's straight up indoctrination. The quality of the readings has gone down. It's not even this original, the original Frankfurt School. I mean, these are serious thinkers, whatever you think of them, that we've named. It's 2-3 derivatives downstream from that, and much more simplified and silly. And students are, at least the ones who complain to me, are not happy about it. And what about the 85-95% of the ones I never talk to? I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss the notion that they're actually getting indoctrinated and walking out without really questioning what they've been taught.
Let's put it in this context, and then we'll take these responses. On the right, people see the constant pressure for change as an attack on them personally. I think it's often underestimated by the left how personally Americans take having some of these things overthrown, overturned, for what appears to be no reason whatsoever. And yet at the same time, we certainly agree with this kind of quasi-Christian notion of helping our fellow man. Much of the left's rhetoric is couched in Christian symbolism minus the Christianity. This is, it seems to me, the essence of this cultural Marxism discussion that we're having, which we've started out by denying exists, but I think we're now getting to where we think it does exist. Mike, you want to?
Well, I belong to a 2,000-year-old institution, the Catholic Church. Yeah. I understand the power of indoctrination, litany. I know why I get up every Sunday and say I believe in one church, God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. believe me, it's not a coincidence that it is the Catholic countries of Europe, Italy, Spain, and France, where the Communist Party really did have the greatest power, when they got 20-30% at one point, and in Protestant Europe, much less so. Now, I lost my train of thought. I'm having a moment here.
Well, we're just talking about doesn't cultural Marxism, what this whole discussion for the last 30 minutes has really been showing the influence of philosophical thought and how it's actively changed the country.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. That's the thing, is that obviously, Nicole, if the students are hearing only one side of the argument, are hearing only a Marxist explanation, and if we, and by the way, Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States is still it's still in the top 10 in political books. It was published in 1980, and if you go on Amazon, why is that? Because it's taught to kids starting in junior high, high school, and definitely in college. So, I mean, that is indoctrination. When I mean, plain and simple, I don't know how you can deny that.
But I want to get back to this notion that on the right, they feel under attack by these ideas. Mike, can you pick that?
Under attack by cultural, I mean...
By cultural change, yes, by the rapid pace.
Well, look, the people who, you mentioned the progressives. I mean, like I said, these things have very deep roots. At least in the beginning, most of these thinkers are actually pretty explicit. We think America's bad. The founding principles are bad. The Declaration of Independence is either a sham, right, and they knew it was a trick they were playing on you, or they were just dumb and they got it all wrong and we know better, right? They're open about this, saying we're going to attack you. Over time, certain thinkers, writers start to get more and more coy about it, but if you dig in, you do the research, you realize it's fairly explicit. So, you know, I feel sort of gaslit if someone's going to say to me, oh, we're not attacking your ideas, and I can like quote these texts and go, you know, what about that? I mean, it says you are, so what are you talking about? Well, it's not me. I don't even remember reading these guys. But again, what's the background radiation? You used the phrase earlier, the wrong side of history. Well, where does that come from, right? Ultimately, it's a Hegelian thought transmitted in part through Marx, transmitted in the 20th century through Kojève, and all the students, this massive amount of students that he taught, almost all of whom ended up on the left he taught at a Hegel seminar, the who's who of all the Western European and continental intellectuals of the 20th century, right? That's what gets into the background noise. Now, I actually don't believe there is a right or a wrong side to history. I believe that there's a good and bad, right and wrong that are permanent and exist by nature. So did the American founders, right? But I find it, it's, you know, whether we specifically remember where we got the idea or where we didn't, or what we read or what we didn't, depending on people's educations, their thought can go in a completely different direction. And Hegel's ideas, Kojève's ideas, are not ultimately compatible with the way the American founders saw justice, the good, right, truth, and the way I see it. So it's hard for me not to say that these ideas are attacking the metaphysical foundations of what I hold most dearly and of the country that they're based on.
Yeah, so before we go into our final comments, now do either of you like to address this issue of the resentment that a constant barrage of leftist ideas have on the much, much larger body politic, and to also what extent you've been successful in moving the social and economic needle of your own particular...
Before you say anything, Mike, I just want to respond to this, these attacks on the founding fathers and the principles of American society. I think that, of course, no one is denying that the left has been extremely critical of the power dynamics and hierarchies that are, you know, reproduced and evident throughout the history of the United States. The founding fathers were slave owners, right? We think about the kind of rights that existed for only a very small group of people at that time in our history, and of course we should be critical and strive for something better and say that everyone should enjoy the ability and opportunities to thrive. That goes without saying. And when we keep saying indoctrination, it's, you know, it's you can say indoctrination, or you can say that people just learn and read and they are taught things. Just as, you say you grew up in the Catholic Church, and you teach, if you have children, I don't know if you do, I have children, I teach them things, and I have my own moral framework. I mean, that's part of passing on knowledge to the next generation, right? We teach our children what we believe in. And, I don't, the idea that only on the left is there this kind of residual conspiracy of ideas throughout history, and that doesn't exist for the sort of right-wing ideas is also seems improbable.
All right, this leads us into our final remarks.
Well, I was just briefly on your original question about social change.
Yeah, it has to be brief because we're running up against time.
I'll just say very briefly that I think you're correct to note that sometimes people perceive the various forms of social change as personal attacks, but the left case is that life is better for everyone when we're not clinging to these personal power hierarchies that come from being white, from being a man, et cetera, and view each other as sort of a part of a common project and not people to have domination and hierarchies over. That's our case.
Okay, let's begin with the second negative. Was that you, Nicole?
Yes.
Yes, would you have 4 minutes, please?
Okay, I don't think I need 4 minutes because I've talked plenty. But I will say just a couple things. I think in listening to both of you, and knowing Micah as I do, I think that there is some common ground in a respect for critical thinking and for really trying to understand the position of people whose political viewpoints might be different from yours. And also, if we're thinking about building a movement that's grounded in working people, we need to listen to their voices, right? And listen to, what people want and how they feel about the world. So if we're thinking about, grievances felt by, regular folks who, ascribe themselves as sort of a right-wing politics, then that's important. And we should, figure out a way to, make life better for everyone, not just people who agree with us politically.
Michael Anton.
First, I want to briefly defend the American founders. So you mentioned slavery. Of course, you have to mention slavery, the original sin of the United States. But as a fellow grad student of mine once put it, I thought rather powerfully, he said, second only to the family, slavery is the oldest institution in human history. It's been around forever. You also mentioned rights. Nobody was talking about rights outside of political philosophy books in a real political context until the American founders declared that human beings' equal individual natural rights were the only legitimate basis for rule. They did that. They blazed that trail. I believe if you have a close reading of Aristotle's Politics, a close reading of Aquinas on slavery, if you read it very, very closely, their surface acceptance conceals an esoteric rejection that they have to conceal because of the society that they live in. Founders say very bluntly, all men are created equal. 49 years later, slavery is gone from the North American or from the United States, from the North American continent. That is an achievement. When you criticize the founding, I mean, it's one thing to criticize the founding for its shortcomings. I think that's justifiable. But what I hear a lot of times is just a complete delegitimation where I think they absolutely deserve credit because the rights, the human dignity, the things you want to talk about, if these things are real, they would exist in nature with or without the American founding, but they still have to be implemented in the real world. And the American founders were the first to even try to do that. And I think they're still the most successful. The second point I would make is when you ascribed privilege per se, to race, sex, et cetera, that's very cult Marx to me. I mean, Marx, I don't know that he would say that. To him, privilege is a matter of capital accumulation and your power within society. Laid off coal miners or steel workers or something, they may be male and they may be white, but they don't feel particularly privileged if they haven't had a job for the last 20 years and seen their wages decline and their savings get spent down and they have no pension. And that's the opposite. That's a kind of cult Marx division that you were talking about. That's not bringing people together. I think a much better way to bring people together, the twofold way, in my view, is along the founders' ideas of common equal natural rights and common citizenship, and then an economic agenda that would be fairly centrist, let's call it even bipartisan, that would take steps with industrial policy, tariffs, tax policy, things like that, without actual confiscation and redistribution to reduce income inequality. That's the kind of future politics I would like to see. And I think it could be possible to build a 55, 60% governing majority on that platform if anybody could figure out a way to do it.
Micah.
In direct response to that, just to be clear, I wasn't arguing for a politics based on focusing on privileges. I agree with you that the laid-off coal miner in West Virginia, for him, the wages of whiteness they're not too high. They won't pay the bills. I was just responding to the question of social change being felt as a personal attack on people and recognizing that we can move beyond that in a common project. And I think that our politics in the 21st century, the rising socialist movement that we're a part of, they're responding to real crises, and the resurgence in interest in our politics are responses to constant imperialist war, persistent inequalities of climate catastrophe. All of that are sort of objective facts, and it's not because someone laid siege to cultural institutions 50 or however many years ago that they're finally, the seeds are finally sprouting now. It's that there are a number of really grave social crises in this country, and socialists seem to be set up pretty well to solve them in many people's minds, millions of people's minds at this point. So that is where our politics come from. That's what they're rooted in, and that's how we're going to go forward fighting for them.
Mike Gonzalez.
Yes. You brought up earlier the fact that the left says, well, we're actually taking a page off of Christianity in that we want to be charitable and have equality. But Christianity at bottom is based on that bargain, forgiving my trespasses as I forgive those who trespass against me. Marxism is built on exactly the opposite, on stoking resentment, on stoking grievances. Identity politics, cultural Marxism is built on this. Again, Gramsci, Marcuse, here's Gramsci. Every revolution has been preceded by an intense labor of criticism, by the diffusion of culture, by the spread of idea among masses of men who are at first resistant and to think of solving their own immediate economic and political problems first, who have no ties of solidarity with others of the same condition. What the revolutionary vanguard that I think you may represent does is try to instill the sense of grievance where we have what we know today as a culture of victimhood, where you get your value not from your achievements or your traits, but from the fact that you can claim victimhood. And that, I think, is very deleterious for society, and it is meant to introduce this, first to tear away at the American ideals of small government. And going back to the founding, back up what Michael said, it's no coincidence that Lincoln says, why did Jefferson put in all men are created equal? He had no need to put that phrase in there to defeat the British. He put it there for somebody like me to come along and do what I am doing. And why does MLK go to the mall and say, I'm here to cash a promissory note? This promissory note comes from the Declaration of Independence. These ideas is what liberated America. It's what helps us solve our problems. When you tear down these ideas, you're tearing down the reason why people come here. And at the end of the day, it is that decides the case. Nobody leaves a mass capitalist democracies and goes to live in communist countries. That doesn't happen. That's never happened. It's always the other way around. People flee communism. They have to be stopped by walls. They have to be stopped by guards. They come to democracies. It's people voting with their feet is all the argument we need to know what system works and what system is a complete failure.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of minutes left. If anyone has a last final thought that he or she would
I would like to just say something about your points, Mike. No one is interested in tearing down, the lofty values and good ideas that were present at the founding of this country. That's not what my point was. It's easy to say that because it's an easy way to tar the left, but it's not true. And I think this idea that socialists are just about instilling victimhood is also an unfair smear. It's about giving people the analytical tools to understand their situation, but it's also about building solidarity and giving people feel a sense of their power, and that if they can connect with other people like them, ordinary people, and raise their voice together, that they can make change to make their life together better together.
Mike, do you have a last word?
I could end on a light note if you think that would help. With a quote.
I hope
Or
it's really funny.
I think it's pretty good. It's Tom Wolfe. So we started, I'm going to go back to where we began, right? Which is, as Mike said, the revolution didn't happen because the proletariat didn't rise up. Why didn't they rise up? Well, it turns out Marxist theory and a lot of the Marxists misjudged the character. And this is Wolfe describing this in the mid-20th century. It says, on top of that, we, meaning Western society broadly, created an affluence that reached clear down to the level of mechanics and tradesmen on a scale that would have made the Sun King blink, so that on any given evening, even a neo-fabulist or a minimalist electrician or air conditioner mechanic or burglar alarm repairman might very well be in St. Kitts or Barbados or Puerto Vallarta wearing a Harry Belafonte cane cutter shirt open to the sternum, the better to reveal the gold chains twinkling in his chest hair, while he and his third wife sit on the terrace and have a little designer water before dinner. In other words, when the working class essentially got some money, what did they do? They went out and they bought big cars and motorcycles and they spent it. They didn't decide. They were sort of happy that the revolution never came because the revolutionaries, or at least the theorists of the revolution, misjudged the people that they were ostensibly leading. And that's why you need that vanguard.
Marcuse says that in One Dimensional Man. I'm going to send you a copy. Marcuse says,
I own it.
Marcuse says, this system works. It satisfies their needs. And he's horrified by this.
Yes, let me just sum up now in our last minute or two. I think it's a very stimulating debate, and I thank all four of you for your interaction and well thought out remarks. I think we've interestingly and perhaps surprisingly found a possible several points of intersection. The wealth tax that Michael Anton defended, and
I'll be against the three of them.
I personally agree with him on this.
I merely sympathize with it.
You agree?
On the wealth tax?
Oh, he agrees with me.
Absolutely, yes. In terms of unearned income that you married.
Wait, who do you agree with?
With Mike Anton.
Oh.
Yeah, so I'm just saying that is one area that there is possible crossover. The leftist defense of certain social programs, however aping the morals of Christianity, have certainly now found an institutional home in the United States government. The questions that I think remain for all of us to think about is the reliance on buzzwords on the left, such as hierarchy, power, the atomization of the electorate into groups that seems to be to diminish the common humanity and still relies somewhat on a conspiracy theory, which, according to the left, on the right, we have the conspiracy theory of cultural Marxism. So both sides seem to still be wary of each other, somewhat resentful. I don't think that we've changed any minds in terms of where people stand, but perhaps we've opened up some paths for a spirited and frank and civil discussion, which I would like to thank you all for very much, and thank the audience for participating as well. Thank you very much, everyone.